The rain had been falling for 3 hours, turning the settlement into a maze of mud and rushing water. Inside his cabin, Duncan MacReady knelt at his open doorway, watching the stream flow past his threshold without a single drop entering. 6 feet away, his neighbor Owen Brennan was frantically using a wooden bucket to bail water from his flooded cabin floor. The narrow stone-lined trench at Duncan's doorway, the one the entire settlement had mocked as dangerous and useless, was doing exactly what he had designed it to do. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what frontier innovation stories interest you most. And if you want to see more lost wisdom from the American frontier, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might just change how you think about survival. April 1839 brought an unusually heavy spring thaw to eastern Wyoming territory. Duncan MacReady stood in the doorway of his cabin that morning, watching meltwater run down the hillside toward his door. He had built this cabin 3 years earlier, using methods every frontiersman knew. Notched logs, mud chinking, a simple threshold where the bottom log met the ground. It had seemed solid enough. It had kept his small family warm through 3 winters. He stepped forward to walk outside. His weight came down on the threshold log. The wood gave way beneath his boot like stepping on rotten fruit. Duncan caught himself on the doorframe, his leg plunging through the collapsed threshold into the mud below. He pulled himself back inside and knelt to examine what had happened. The entire threshold log had rotted through, not just surface damage. The wood was soft, dark, crumbling in his hands like wet paper. He could push his fingers into it without effort. His wife Rachel appeared behind him, 7 months pregnant with their first child. She looked at the collapsed threshold, then at Duncan's face. She did not need to ask what it meant. Over. The next hour, Duncan examined every bottom log of the cabin. The damage was catastrophic. Every log touching the ground showed advanced rot. The walls were still standing, but the foundation was failing. In another month, maybe 2, the entire structure would be unsafe. They had 3 months of food supplies inside, all of Duncan's trapping equipment, the furs he had not yet sold, Rachel's few precious possessions from Scotland, and nowhere else to go except crowding into a neighbor's already cramped cabin. Owen Brennan came over within the hour, bringing 2 other men from the settlement. They helped Duncan and Rachel move everything out. By evening, the MacReadys were sleeping on the floor of the Brennan cabin, their belongings stacked in a corner, their own home standing empty and condemned. That night, Duncan could not sleep. He kept thinking about the softness of that wood, how completely it had failed. He had built the cabin carefully. He had used good logs. He had followed every technique the older settlers had taught him, and it had rotted anyway. The next morning, he walked back to his abandoned cabin. He pulled out the collapsed threshold log and examined it in full daylight. The rot had started from the bottom, where the wood touched the ground. The top surface was still relatively sound, but the bottom half was destroyed. He looked at the ground where the threshold had sat. The soil was dark, wet, saturated. Even now, days after the last rain, the earth at the doorway stayed damp. Duncan touched the wet soil, then touched the rotted wood. A question formed in his mind that would not leave him alone. Why did the wood fail? And more importantly, could it have been prevented? Duncan spent the next 6 weeks living in Owen Brennan's cabin, while Rachel helped with cooking and household work to earn their keep. But Duncan was barely present. Every day, he walked the surrounding territory, searching for abandoned cabins. He found them everywhere. Within 20 miles of the settlement, he located 14 structures that had been built and then deserted. Every single one showed the same failure pattern. The bottom logs had rotted. The walls above remained relatively sound, but the foundation had given way. Most had collapsed doorways. Some had corners that had settled and torn apart as the lowest logs disintegrated. Duncan began taking notes in a small journal Rachel had given him. He measured the rot depth in each cabin. He examined the soil conditions around each structure. He looked at how water flowed across the terrain during rainstorms. A pattern emerged with absolute consistency. The doorways always rotted first. The threshold logs, where people walked in and out, failed within 3 to 5 years. The soil around every doorway was waterlogged. Rain naturally flowed downhill, and cabin doors were always placed on the downhill side for drainage away from the structure. But that meant water flowed directly toward the entrance during every storm. He visited Malcolm Dunbar, the oldest settler in the territory. Dunbar had been living in the wilderness for 23 years. His current cabin was his fifth. Duncan asked him about the rot problem. Dunbar shrugged. Wood rots. That is frontier life. You build a cabin, it lasts 5 years, maybe 7 if you are lucky. Then you build another one. Every man here knows this. But why does it rot? Duncan pressed. The wood is sound when we cut it. What happens? It sits on wet ground, Dunbar said, as if explaining something to a child. Wet wood rots. Nothing to be done about it. You can put down planks at the doorway. You can pack mud around the threshold. You can build the door higher. None of it matters. Wood and water do not get along. Eventually, the water wins. Duncan thanked him and left, but he could not accept Dunbar's resignation. Wood and water did not get along. That much was true. But there had to be a way to keep them apart. He began sketching ideas in his journal. Elevated foundations made of stone, but gathering that much stone was impossible for one man. Thicker logs that would take longer to rot, but they would still rot eventually. Covering the threshold with metal, but metal was impossibly expensive on the frontier. Every solution he imagined failed for practical reasons. Too expensive, too labor-intensive, too dependent on materials that did not exist in the wilderness. Then, one afternoon, standing in a rainstorm outside his ruined cabin, he watched water flow. It ran downhill in streams, following the natural gradient of the land. It pooled wherever the ground was level or depressed, and it saturated the soil everywhere it pooled. The soil around his doorway was a permanent mud pit. Even days after rain, it stayed wet. The ground never fully dried because water kept flowing to that spot. Duncan knelt in the mud, not caring that he was soaking himself. He dug his fingers into the saturated earth. This was the problem, not the wood itself. The ground. The wood rotted because it sat in perpetually wet soil. He walked back to the Brennan cabin that evening and found Rachel mending clothes by candlelight. He sat down beside her, his clothes still muddy and wet. "What if we are solving the wrong problem?" he said. Rachel looked at him, waiting. "Everyone tries to protect the wood from water," Duncan continued. "But what if the answer is not keeping water away from the wood? What if it is keeping the water away from the ground under the wood?" Rachel set down her mending. "How would you do that?" "I do not know yet," Duncan admitted. "But I think that is the right question." Summer 1839 arrived, and Duncan began building his new cabin on higher ground 200 yards from the old site. He chose a spot with better drainage, a natural slope that carried water away from where the structure would stand. The construction followed standard methods. He notched logs for the walls, built a stone fireplace, prepared poles for the roof. But he deliberately left the doorway unfinished. For 2 weeks, he did nothing but watch rainstorms. Every time clouds gathered, Duncan stood where his doorway would be, observing how water moved across the land. The pattern never changed. Water ran downhill directly toward the entrance, following the natural gradient of the terrain. Rachel brought him food during these observations. She said nothing about the neighbors who thought he had lost his mind. She simply left the food and went back to help Owen's wife with household work. Duncan began to understand something critical. You could not stop water from flowing downhill. That was gravity, and gravity always won. The question was not how to block the water, the question was how to control where it went. He sketched ideas in his journal, a shallow depression to catch water, but his observations showed that shallow depressions filled immediately and overflowed. The water needed volume capacity and a defined path away from the cabin. One afternoon, he knelt where his threshold would be and used a stick to dig a test trench, just a few inches deep, narrow enough to step over. He watched the next rain. Water flowed into the trench, filled it within minutes, and overflowed, not deep enough. He dug it deeper, 6 inches this time. The next rain filled it more slowly, but it still did not drain properly. It just pooled in the trench. Duncan realized he needed 2 things: depth to hold water volume and slope to move the water away from the cabin. He dug the trench deeper on one end, creating a gentle decline that led away from the doorway. The next storm showed improvement. Water flowed into the trench and moved along the channel. But the dirt bottom quickly turned to mud, and the sides began to erode and collapse. He walked to a nearby creek and studied how water flowed through natural channels. The creek bed was lined with stones. The water flowed over them without eroding the channel. The stones created a stable surface that directed flow without breaking down. That evening, Duncan returned to the Brennan cabin and found Rachel sitting outside. He sat beside her. "You are going to dig a trench where we walk every day," she said. 6 to 8 inches deep, Duncan confirmed. Lined with stones. Sloped to carry water away from the threshold. Rachel was quiet. "Owen says you are wasting time. Malcolm says it will just fill with mud." "They might be right," Duncan admitted. "But you do not think so. The ground under our threshold needs to stay dry. I think this is the only way." Rachel nodded. "Then we dig." The next morning, Duncan began marking the trench line with cord. 4 feet long, 8 inches wide, 6 to 8 inches deep. Owen Brennan stopped by. "You are putting a pit where you will walk every day. Someone is going to break an ankle." "Better than a rotted cabin," Duncan replied. Owen walked away, muttering about wasted effort. Duncan picked up his shovel. The entire settlement would mock him. He had no guarantee it would work, but doing what everyone else did would get him what everyone else got. A cabin that rotted in 5 years. He began to dig. Late summer 1839, and Duncan MacReady began digging in earnest. The work was brutal from the first shovel stroke. The soil looked soft, but 6 inches down he hit compacted earth mixed with rocks. Each shovelful required force. Each rock required prying loose with the blade edge or his hands. He marked the trench dimensions carefully. 4 feet long, spanning the doorway width plus 2 feet on each side. 8 inches wide, narrow enough to step over without difficulty. 6 to 8 inches deep, enough to hold water volume during heavy storms. The first day, he completed 1 foot of length. His hands developed new blisters despite years of calluses from trapping and construction work. His back ached from the constant bending and lifting. He had expected the work to be difficult. He had not expected it to be this slow. The second day, his shovel handle cracked while prying out a large stone. He spent an hour fashioning a replacement from a piece of oak. By evening, he had completed another foot of trench. Neighbors began stopping by to watch. Most said nothing. They simply stood, looked at the growing trench, and walked away shaking their heads. Malcolm Dunbar visited on the 3rd day. He watched Duncan work for several minutes. "That will just fill with water and overflow," Dunbar finally said. Duncan paused, leaning on his shovel. "Not if I slope it properly and line it with stones. And when someone trips in the dark and breaks their leg? The alternative is rebuilding my cabin in 5 years." Dunbar grunted and left without another word. Young Finn O'Malley stopped by on the 4th morning. He was 19, had built his own cabin the previous year. He watched Duncan measure the depth with a stick, checking that it remained consistent at 7 inches. "Why are you making it so deep?" Finn asked. "Needs to hold water during storms without overflowing," Duncan explained. "Shallow trenches fill immediately. This depth gives it capacity. But that is a lot of digging. 4 days of digging now or replacing rotted threshold logs every 3 years. I choose 4 days." Finn nodded slowly and walked away. Duncan noticed he did not shake his head like the others. By the end of the 4th day, the excavation was complete. 4 feet long, 8 inches wide, 7 inches deep on average. Duncan had maintained a slight gradient, making the western end an inch deeper than the eastern end. Water would flow naturally from east to west, away from the cabin and down the hillside. He stood back and examined his work. The trench looked strange, unnatural, a deliberate gash in the earth, right where people would walk. He understood why his neighbors thought he was foolish. Rachel came out as evening approached. She looked at the completed excavation, then at Duncan's blistered hands. 4 days, she said quietly. 4 days, Duncan confirmed. Now the stones. Duncan nodded. Tomorrow he would begin the next phase. Walking creek beds, selecting flat stones, carrying them back one at a time. The work was far from finished, but the foundation was laid. The trench existed. Now he had to make it functional. Early autumn 1839, and Duncan MacReady walked the creek beds searching for stones. He needed specific characteristics, flat on at least two sides for stability, approximately 6 inches wide to match the trench width, various lengths to allow fitting them together like puzzle pieces, and dense enough to withstand water flow without breaking apart. He found the first suitable stone a quarter-mile from his cabin. Flat granite, 8 inches wide, 12 inches long. He carried it back in a canvas sack. Then he returned for another and another. The work was repetitive and exhausting. Each trip took 30 minutes. Each stone weighed between 5 and 15 pounds. He needed approximately 60 stones to line the entire trench. That meant 60 trips, 30 hours of walking, carrying constant weight. Rachel offered to help. Duncan refused. She was 8 months pregnant now, moving slowly, tiring easily. He would not risk her health for stones. By the end of the first day, he had collected 20 stones. They sat in a pile beside the trench, waiting. Duncan examined each one again, rejecting 3 that had cracks he had not noticed at the creek. He walked back and found replacements. The second day brought 40 stones total. The third day, he reached 65, more than he needed. But having extras meant he could select the best fits during installation. On the fourth day, Duncan began placing stones. He started at the western end, where the trench was deepest. He wanted the largest, most stable stones at the point where water pressure would be highest as it flowed out of the channel. He set the first stone along the northern wall of the trench. It sat firmly, its flat side vertical, creating a solid barrier. He placed a second stone beside it, adjusting until the edges met closely. Then a third. The southern wall received the same treatment. The stones did not fit perfectly. Gaps existed between some, but Duncan was not trying to create a watertight seal. He was creating a stable channel that would direct water flow without eroding. After lining 6 inches of trench, he tested stability by pressing down hard on each stone with his boot. 2 shifted slightly. He removed them, adjusted the soil beneath, and reset them. This time, they held firm. Owen Brennan stopped by late that afternoon. He watched Duncan fit stones with meticulous care, rejecting one because it wobbled, selecting a different shape that sat solidly. "All this for a ditch," Owen said. Duncan looked up. "All this so my daughter is not born in your cabin." Owen's expression changed. The mockery left his face. He stood quietly for a moment, then walked away without another word. By evening, Duncan had lined 1 foot of trench. 3 feet remained. At this pace, the stone installation would take 3 more days. Rachel brought him food as darkness fell. She looked at the partially completed work. "It looks like a tiny creek," she observed. Duncan smiled. "That is exactly what it is. A creek I built to carry water away from our home." Late September 1839, and Duncan's cabin stood complete except for the final door hanging. The stone-lined trench stretched across the threshold, looking almost decorative in the dry autumn weather. Duncan had packed clay mixture behind the stones to secure them, careful not to block the channel floor where water needed to flow. He had tested the system artificially. 3 times he carried buckets of water from the creek and poured them into the trench at the eastern end. Each time, the water flowed through the stone-lined channel and drained away down the hillside gradient. The system worked in theory, but theory and reality were different things. He needed actual rainfall to know if the trench would handle storm conditions. The dry weather continued. Days passed. Duncan and Rachel moved into the cabin, arranging their few possessions, sleeping in their own home again after months in Owen Brennan's crowded space. But every morning, Duncan looked at the sky, hoping for clouds. Early October brought the first test. Dark clouds gathered in the afternoon. By evening, rain began falling steadily. Not a violent storm, but consistent rainfall that would reveal how the system performed. Duncan and Rachel stood in the doorway, watching. Water ran down the hillside toward the cabin, following the same path it always followed. But instead of pooling at the threshold, it flowed into the trench. The channel began filling. The water level rose to perhaps 3 inches deep, half the porous trench capacity. The gradient Duncan had built into the design began working. Water moved through the stone-lined channel from east to west, flowing away from the cabin and continuing down the hillside. No overflow occurred, no pooling around the threshold logs. The system was handling the rainfall exactly as Duncan had designed it to do. They watched for an hour as rain continued. The water level in the trench remained constant at roughly half depth. Water flowed in at the eastern end and flowed out at the western end in equilibrium. Duncan knelt and touched the soil beside the threshold log. Damp, but not saturated. He compared it to what he remembered from his old cabin, where the ground at the doorway had been perpetual mud. This was dramatically different. 50 yards away, Owen Brennan's cabin showed the familiar pattern. Water pooled at his threshold. Owen had placed flat stones to step on, trying to keep his boots dry as he moved in and out. But the ground around his doorway was becoming the same mud pit every cabin developed. The contrast was visible to anyone watching. Duncan's threshold stayed relatively dry. Owen's threshold sat in standing water. Rachel placed her hand on Duncan's shoulder. "It worked. It worked for one storm," Duncan replied. "We need winter. We need spring thaw. We need years to know if it truly works." But standing there, watching water flow harmlessly through his stone-lined channel, while his neighbor fought mud and pooling water, Duncan allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. The trench was doing its job. Winter 1839 brought new concerns. The first hard freeze turned the water in Duncan's trench to ice. He worried that the ice would crack the stones or create a dangerous surface at the doorway. But the depth of the channel proved beneficial. Ice formed, but only on the surface. The stones beneath remained stable, and the ice was easy to step over, no more hazardous than the frozen ground around it. Owen Brennan's doorway became a sheet of ice where water had pooled and frozen. He slipped twice in 1 week, nearly injuring himself. The third time, his wife fell, bruising her hip badly. They began using the back window to enter and exit the cabin until the thaw arrived. Spring 1840 brought the critical test. March snowmelt created the worst flooding the settlement had seen in years. The ground saturated completely. Water ran in streams down every hillside. Cabins built in low areas took on water despite being sealed tightly. Duncan stood at his doorway, watching the deluge. Water flowed toward his threshold in volume he had never anticipated. The trench filled to capacity within minutes. For a moment, Duncan thought it would overflow, but the stone lining and gradient he had built into the design saved him. Water moved through the channel faster than it arrived. The trench stayed full, but did not overflow. The flow continued steadily westward, draining down the hillside and away from the cabin. Duncan's threshold logs sat in damp soil, but not standing water. The ground beneath them remained firm. Owen Brennan's cabin flooded. 3 inches of water covered his floor by midday. Owen and his family spent hours bailing with buckets, trying to save their supplies. By evening, they had removed most of the water, but their threshold logs sat in complete saturation. The wood soaked up moisture like a sponge. Malcolm Dunbar's cabin, built 15 years earlier and already on its 3rd threshold replacement, flooded even worse. The old man stood outside watching water pour through his doorway, too tired to fight it anymore. Young Finn O'Malley's cabin, built just 2 years prior, took on water that pooled around his threshold. Finn spent the day digging a shallow drainage ditch, trying to divert water away. His effort helped slightly, but could not solve the fundamental problem. His threshold logs were sitting in saturated ground that would stay wet for weeks. After the flood subsided, Owen Brennan walked to Duncan's cabin. He examined the trench, still flowing with residual runoff. He looked at Duncan's dry cabin interior, then back at his own flooded home. "How deep did you make that trench?" Owen asked. 6 to 8 inches, Duncan replied. "Stone-lined, sloped for drainage." Owen was quiet for a long moment. "I called it useless. I was wrong. You want help digging one?" Owen nodded slowly. "I do." Within a month, 2 cabins in the settlement had stone-lined trenches at their doorways. The innovation had its first convert. Spring 1844 brought unprecedented rainfall to Wyoming territory. 3 days of continuous storms saturated the ground completely. Every creek overflowed. Every hillside became a waterfall. The settlement transformed into a network of streams and rivers where dry paths had existed days before. Duncan stood at his doorway on the fourth morning, watching water flow past his threshold. The trench was filled to capacity, functioning at its absolute limit. Water poured through the stone-lined channel in a continuous rush. Occasionally, small amounts overflowed onto the ground beside the trench, but the majority of the flow stayed contained and directed away from the cabin. Inside, the floor remained dry except for a thin line of dampness, where perhaps an inch of water had seeped past during the night's heaviest rainfall. Duncan had mopped it up at dawn. His threshold logs were wet but not submerged. They would dry within days once the rain stopped. 50 yards away, Owen Brennan's cabin told a different story. Owen had installed his trench in 1840 after the spring flooding convinced him Duncan's method worked. His cabin was handling the deluge almost as well as Duncan's. Water flowed through his trench system and his interior stayed largely dry. But the rest of the settlement suffered catastrophically. Finn O'Malley's cabin, now 5 years old and built without a trench, flooded severely. Water pooled around his threshold throughout the night. At dawn on the fourth day, the saturated threshold log collapsed under its own weight. The structural failure created an opening that allowed water to pour directly inside. Finn, his wife, and their infant daughter had to evacuate through the window, wading through knee-deep water to reach higher ground. Malcolm Dunbar's cabin, already weakened by years of threshold replacements and bottom log rot, suffered complete failure. The flooding undermined what remained of his foundation. By midday, one corner of the cabin had settled 6 inches, creating dangerous instability. Malcolm abandoned the structure entirely, moving in with another family. 3 other cabins in the settlement took on serious water damage. Food supplies were ruined, bedding soaked through. Families spent the day bailing water and salvaging what they could. When the rain finally stopped on the 5th day, the settlement gathered to assess damage. The contrast was undeniable. 2 cabins with trenches stood relatively dry and structurally sound. 7 cabins without trenches had suffered flooding, and 2 faced major structural repairs or complete rebuilding. Malcolm Dunbar approached Duncan that evening. The old man looked exhausted, defeated. He had spent 15 years on the frontier, built 5 cabins, and now faced building a 6th at age 57. "Duncan," he said quietly, "would you show me how to dig one of those trenches?" Within a week, Finn O'Malley began rebuilding his collapsed cabin. The first thing he constructed, before raising a single log, was a 6-inch deep stone-lined trench across where his threshold would be. 3 other families asked Duncan for instruction. The settlement's attitude toward the useless trench had fundamentally changed. Late 1840s, and the trench system had become standard practice in the Wyoming settlement. Every new cabin built included a stone-lined drainage channel at the threshold. Families rebuilding after the catastrophic flood of 1844 installed trenches before doing anything else. The innovation that had been mocked 5 years earlier was now considered essential. Summer 1849 brought a visitor who would carry the technique far beyond Wyoming territory. Callum Fraser was a traveling builder, a Scotsman who had spent 20 years constructing cabins, trading posts, and small structures across the frontier. He was passing through the settlement on his way to Oregon Territory, stopping to trade supplies and rest his horses. He noticed immediately that every cabin had an unusual feature: stone-lined trenches at the doorways. He had built 43 cabins across 3 territories and had never seen anything like it. Callum asked Owen Brennan about the trenches while trading for cornmeal. Owen told him the story: the collapsed cabin in 1839, Duncan's obsessive investigation of rot patterns, the mockery he had faced while digging what everyone called a useless pit. The spring flood of 1840 that had proven the system's worth. Callum walked to Duncan's cabin that afternoon. Duncan was repairing a section of roof, but he climbed down to talk. Callum asked detailed questions. How deep? 6 to 8 inches. How wide? 8 inches, narrow enough to step over. Why stones? They create stable channels that do not erode. What about the gradient? Slight slope to move water away from the structure. I have built cabins for 2 decades, Callum said. Every one of them will rot at the threshold within 5 years. You are telling me this trench prevents that? "Mine is 10 years old," Duncan replied. "Original threshold logs, no rot." Callum examined Duncan's threshold closely. The wood was weathered but solid, no soft spots. No discoloration indicating moisture damage. He pressed his knife blade against the wood. It was hard, dry, structurally sound. "May I teach this technique in Oregon?" Callum asked. Duncan looked surprised. "It is not mine to give permission for. It is just common sense that took me too long to figure out. If it helps people build better cabins, teach it." Callum left the settlement a week later. He carried detailed notes about trench depth, stone selection, and gradient requirements. Over the next 3 years, he built 17 cabins in Oregon Territory. Every one included a threshold trench. By 1852, reports filtered back to Wyoming that Oregon settlers were using something called the Wyoming drainage method. A guidebook for Western immigrants published in 1853 included a section on proper doorway construction. The description matched Duncan's design exactly, though it did not mention his name. The technique spread organically. Builders taught settlers taught neighbors. Anyone who saw a 10-year-old cabin with solid threshold logs while their own 3-year-old cabin showed rot wanted to know the secret. By 1855, stone-lined threshold trenches were considered standard practice across wet climate regions of the frontier. 1868 arrived, 29 years after Duncan MacReady had dug his first trench. He was 56 years old now, his dark hair gone gray, his hands gnarled from decades of frontier work. Rachel had passed away 2 years prior, after a brief illness. Their 3 children had grown and moved to California during the gold rush years, building lives far from Wyoming Territory. Duncan lived alone in the cabin that had made him quietly famous across the frontier. The structure stood solid, its threshold logs from 1839 still structurally sound. He had replaced roof poles twice and rechinking portions of the walls, but the foundation remained as stable as the day he had finished it. The trench still functioned perfectly. Duncan cleared debris from it perhaps once each year, a simple maintenance task that took less than an AB par hour. The stones had worn smooth from 3 decades of water flow, but the channel remained intact and effective. On a warm afternoon in late summer, a young couple arrived at his cabin. They introduced themselves as settlers heading west, planning to build near the South Pass. They had heard about the MacReady cabin from a builder in Colorado who had learned the trench technique and wanted to see the original before constructing their own home. Duncan showed them the trench, explaining the principles one more time. 6 to 8 inches deep for volume capacity, stone-lined to prevent erosion, slope to direct water away from the structure. Simple concepts that solved a problem the entire frontier had accepted as unsolvable. The young man knelt to examine the ancient stonework. "Did you ever imagine it would spread so far?" he asked. Duncan shook his head. "I just did not want my daughter born in someone else's cabin. I was not trying to change how people built. I was trying to keep my threshold from rotting." "But you did change it," the young woman said. "Our builder said every cabin in the mountains should have a trench. He said it was common sense." "It is common sense now," Duncan replied. "It was not common sense in 1839. The couple thanked him and left to begin their journey west. Duncan watched them disappear down the trail, then sat in his doorway as evening approached. He looked at the trench, worn but functional after 3 decades. He thought about the cabin he had lost in 1839, about Rachel bringing him food while neighbors mocked his digging, about Owen Brennan finally admitting he had been wrong, about Malcolm Dunbar swallowing his pride after 15 years of stubborn tradition, about young Finn O'Malley rebuilding with a trench before raising walls. Autumn rain began falling, light but steady. Water flowed into the trench and moved through the channel exactly as designed. Duncan watched it drain away from his threshold, protecting wood that had survived longer than most frontier cabins existed. The impossible had become routine. A cabin that did not rot was just 6 inches of stone-lined trench, and one man's refusal to accept that failure was inevitable.